Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation as part of DMU's Women's International Women's Day programme. My name's Leanne Herbert, and it's my great pleasure to be here today representing DMU's Women's Network and DMU's Disabled Staff Network, and to welcome Dr. Sana Rizvi to share her expertise with us on speaking truth to exclusionary mechanisms, patriarchy, and disability justice. Dr. Rizvi's research centres on the educational experiences of minoritised communities at various intersections, exclusionary processes that affect minoritised communities, and the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of colour as relating to staff and students within the UK HE context. She's passionate about teaching on the subjects of racial inequalities in education, critical perspectives on disability studies and inclusive education, and on qualitative methodologies. She's presented her research at several international and national conferences and has also published research in the field of research methods, racial inequality, and disability studies. Sana is a senior lecturer in education and early childhood studies at Liverpool John Moores University, having also worked as a lecturer in education at the University of Exeter and also here at DMU. So before I hand over to Sana, I'd just like to finish by asking, as we listen to her talking this afternoon, please add any comments or questions in the online chat section as we go throughout, and there will be time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Sana, and thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to the public seminar series. The title of my talk is Speaking Truth to Exclusionary Mechanisms, Patriarchy and Disability Justice. Today's talk is based on my book, Undoing Whiteness in Disability Studies, that reports on research with British Muslim mothers of disabled children and young people. My interest in this area grew out of a conversation that took place between school pastoral manager of a special school, myself, 11 years ago, on another research project that I was doing. I was quite eager to do a project based on schools' needs, and the pastoral manager at that point in time of that special school highlighted that they had a very specific issue of Bangladeshi parents' engagement. So I want to sort of relay the kind of conversation that went on 11 years ago that sort of triggered all of this. And I'm going to read it out for accessibility purpose. So the conversation was, this pastoral manager, fictitious name, obviously Alice, she goes, "It's parents from Bangladeshi backgrounds more than any other community. We need to engage them more, but it appears they're just indifferent. We've tried coffee mornings, parent groups. I mean, they just don't attend any of that. I personally think it's because of their women. They're shut up in their houses, aren't they? They're oppressed. They need to get out of their houses. They're living with large families with their in-laws and all their relatives. Where's the privacy?" She continues, "And you know they're all related," in a lower tone. I would get into trouble for saying this, but we all know why they have babies with disabilities. I can't understand how you can marry your cousin and live with his entire family. Where's the romance in that? I felt amused, thinking that Alice was joking. Then I start. Actually, I pause before fulfilling her stereotype about South Asians. I am married to my second cousin, and I live with my in-laws and his siblings. I laugh nervously. Alice, oh my God. There was so much, so this conversation finishes, and there was so much that bothered me about this conversation as I walked towards my car. And I wanted to consider, why was Alice's comment anti-disability justice? Why was it an anti-feminist in its perspective? There was a lot to unpack here. And obviously, I was able to reflect on this conversation, not immediately, because I was early on starting my career. I didn't have the presence of mind to articulate what was really happening and how I was also implicated in this false consciousness of being socialized into thinking in a way about my own community. So at that point, I really wanted, what I should have said was, the school liaison officer lacks, by her very role, should actually have a very good understanding of the kind of communities that she engages with, and that she lacks this perspective of how ethnically minoritized communities do not have the privilege of generational wealth, or do not, or face institutional racism when it comes to house ownership. And all of this was going at the back of my mind because I was thinking, why am I so angry at this? It is because that in her very role that was supposed to be of an ally, and we have to think of who is the ally, and our allies ableist in their positions. Is she doing great? Is she doing justice to the communities that she's working with? So what are they actually excluding from this reading? When pastoral managers or professionals or educators or institutions interact with minoritized communities, they read ethnic minorities in a certain way. When we enter the room, we give an impression of something, and we are immediately read. We are immediately read in terms of our cultural values, immediately read in terms of our language. We're immediately read in terms of how much cultural capital do we bring. We immediately read in terms of our social class, the kind of families we belong. And that reading happens almost simultaneously as we enter the rooms. And that reading is not apolitical, it's not a neutral. It's based on so much of what's going on in the media discourse, official discourse, whatever has been published about South Asian communities. So what are they actually excluding from this reading is an intersectional analysis. So I want to talk briefly about what an intersectional analysis is, because I think you can't really talk about disability justice or challenging patriarchy without talking about what is intersectionality. And I want to clarify a few things about it. When it comes to social inequality of minoritized communities, what happens in most situations is that institutions fixate on identities and do not think about how identities actually intersect with oppressive systems. And the reason why perhaps they don't do this is because they're also part of, and they're part of these oppressive systems. We operate largely in a patriarchal neoliberal capitalist framework where everybody is implicated in everybody else's experiences. So intersectional analysis is really important here, especially if you want to understand how to improve the experiences of minoritized communities, how to improve the experiences of Black and Brown communities, because there are various axes, various isms like racism, anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, xenophobia, that are in operation via different mechanisms like policies, immigration laws, national border acts, that implicate the lives of these communities. So we have to understand that we have to understand experiences at the intersection of identities and these systems. So I have based my work, obviously, on the readings of Surma Bilge and Patricia Hill Collins in their book on intersectional frameworks. And they talk about core principles underpinning intersectional framework. And I think this is something that's really important for institutions that are really committed to social justice work, that are really committed to improving the experiences of the communities that they engage with. So one of the first principles they talk about is social inequality. If your work is grounded in intersectionality, if you're talking about improving the experiences of your communities, you have to tackle social inequality. And one social inequality cannot be addressed without addressing all the other inequalities connected with. So for instance, a majority of Pakistani and British Bangladeshis live below poverty line. They experience institutional racism in terms of employment, house ownership. They have lower attainment levels. They have poor uptake of services. And all of these experiences impact the kind of educational experiences that these communities have. So when we're talking about increasing educational attainment level, we can't do that because unless we start paying attention to improving their access and their rights to better education, housing, employment, and health, and all other aspects. So social inequality has to be understood in terms of its interconnectedness with other inequalities. We also have to tackle the difficult idea of power and power domains, cultural power domains. I'm very much influenced by a disability scholar, Sami Shock, and she talks about there's a state-sanctioned narrative of understanding of disability. And what that means is that we, as nation states, rewrite histories sort of producing this narrative that they offer protection and they respect and recognize the rights of all disabled people or all its citizens, but it doesn't do that. It simultaneously silences or rewrites the narratives of Black and Brown communities through its various policies, such as the National Borders Act, immigration policies, prevent. We can go on and on about different policies that the state employs that specifically target these communities. So as educators and professionals who are committed about this, they do assume that minoritized families lack critical consciousness, they lack agency, and then that they consent to someone speaking on their behalf and making decisions on their behalf. That there is something going on in that respect about power dynamics. So we also have to understand that when communities are actually actively taking back their stories, their narratives, when that happens, what do institutions do? Are they recognizing this as advocacy, as resistance, as progress, or are they categorizing the experiences of minorities' resistance as problematic, troublesome, unruliness that needs to be sanctioned, that needs to be disciplined? So we have to acknowledge that aspect. Another area that we talk about in terms of intersectionality is relationality. And this is really important in terms of, understanding not only majority minority context, but how do differences within group identities create experiences of othering for those holding minoritized or marginalized identities. Now, there is a risk that tokenistic representations can actually harm the causes of communities. What does that mean? It means that when institutions actually at the forefront, we're talking about Women's Day, we're talking about Disability Month, when we talk about celebrating the labor and the achievements and the work and the experiences of minorities, we have to be very careful about who we're picking as celebration. Are we picking gatekeepers? When institutions do listen to minoritized members of community, they must consider whether they're actually speaking to a gatekeeper who actually serves their interests versus the interests of those communities. So we have to talk about being critical about all these dynamics, intergroup dynamics and relationality, if we are seriously committed about forging a way forward, making sure that people benefit, making sure that people have generally a good experience. Another core principle of intersectionality is social context. Using intersectionality as an analytical tool means contextualizing one's arguments. And what does that mean in terms of what institutions do today? There is, again, reluctance from institutions to situate minority experiences in their histories, contexts, and backgrounds, and rush to essentialize or reduce their experiences to cultural or language barriers. But when we do this, what we're actually doing is we're reducing all their experiences to something as a single issue. And again, from a feminist standpoint, there are no single issues. We are all interconnected. There are multiple social inequalities and multiple social contexts that are happening, and we need to recognize that. When we do not recognize the entirety of different backgrounds, the multiple backgrounds or the histories that these migrant communities or immigrant communities have, we're denying their humanity, we're denying their citizenship, we're denying their rights. And we're telling them, hey, we know what's best for you. We have a better idea of what's happening for you. We have a better idea of why you are having poor experiences. So when institutions come up with various, interventions or schemes or programs or initiatives, I think what we have to be very careful about is, are our initiatives primarily based on serving our interest, or and problematizing or further reinforcing the stereotype that these communities should be viewed as problematic? Or are we actually genuinely asking the communities to come forward and sort of outline their own solutions to their own problems? So this is really important. How many times do institutions or schools or educational settings invite parents, invite families, invite pupils, disabled pupils, and young people into the conversation and actively involve them in carving out some new solutions? The other aspect or the principle of intersectionality is complexity. And here, again, we want to talk about, when we talk about intersectionality, I think there is again this idea that to think about minorities in terms of binaries. So if you want to think about Black and Brown students, there's always an institutional rush to sort of bunch them into a singular category and make sure that all the initiatives that we have come up with cater to the BAME community. And I use BAME in quote unquote because it's such a problematic term. Lacking any analysis of the different isms and oppressive structures that affect them differently. So for instance, South Asians have a very different experience of racism versus Black students have a very different experience of racism. Black students face anti-Blackness. They experience anti-Blackness. So when we're thinking about tackling racism, or when we're thinking about tackling racial inequality, we have to be aware of the different isms that specifically target their identities and how it's intertwined with their identities. Finally, institutions that are thinking about social justice, they need to be thinking about asking themselves, this is again going back to how many institutions declare what they're going to do for their communities. Does your activism or social justice work illuminate systems of oppression and resistance? This is such a hard responsibility and such a hard commitment to undertake, because that involves outlining your own complicity. That involves saying, yes, we are operating largely in a structure that utilizes or marginalizes the experiences of communities. So how often are institutions willing to come forward and say, yes, our systems are not perfect. However, we are willing to change our systems. We're willing to sort of listen to the communities and let go of systems that specifically target them. So when communities or when institutions are committed on engaging or doing this social justice work, or doing racially just work, or doing decolonizing work, it has to be linked to critical praxis. Critical praxis meaning it has to lead to some sort of concrete actions at the ground level for the communities. It can't be a temporary solution. So I want to look at some examples. And the examples I provide are from my book. And because I'm a qualitative researcher, I think the best way to show some examples is always to lean into qualitative quotes that my participants shared with me. And I think these quotes sort of illuminate the kind of experiences that minoritized communities face. So I obviously, for my book, I basically talked to British Pakistani mothers of children with disabled children and young people. And I talked to them about a range of issues that they were facing, from schooling to housing to issues in immigration and other aspects. One of the mothers that I talked to, her name is Syra, and obviously this is a fictitious name, full disclosure. She had 3 children who had social, emotional, and mental health needs. And Faraz was her eldest child, who at that time was 18 or 19 years of age. And throughout his schooling experiences, regardless of whether it was a primary school, secondary school, or further education as he was now about to enter, he had been formally excluded from each of the settings. Faraz was diagnosed with ADHD, but instead of putting the right support systems, that diagnosis actually was used to exclude him from various settings. He was exposed to various medical interventions, because ADHD does involve some sort of medical interventions, which he did not fully consent to, but had to if he had to attend educational settings. So part of his condition of being included in an educational setting was based on the fact that he would be taking medical interventions. And during these experiences, as I was talking to Syra, she talked about how Faraz also experienced racism. She talked about how her child experienced bullying. And each time she came forward to the educators, they could not conceive that in a special school or in an educational setting, her child would be experiencing some kind of racism. So this is a quote. I'm going to say the quote. Faraz felt left out. He was the only Pakistani child, and the rest were white. He was repeatedly called, quote, Paki, which I reported, but the teachers said it's not happening. He wasn't learning anything special in that special school. He wanted to go to a mainstream school. The head teacher said he was doing really well. So why couldn't he go back to a mainstream school? I was being fobbed off. He was never given the opportunity to prove himself at a mainstream school. As I talked to this mother, she talked about how bullying and experiences of racism eventually led her child to consider suicide. And he was pushed to this, tragic decision by the experiences, by being completely invalidated by the educational institutions that he attended. And it makes us reflect on, how often do institutions know that students are experiencing these racist incidents, and what are we actually doing about these? Do we actively address them? Do we have a band-aid approach to these ideas? Do we negate it and completely deny that they're not happening? So Saira talked about that not only was the institutions, the schools denying that her child had experienced racism, but they were totally unhelpful towards this phase of her son's life where he was depressed, he was considering suicide, and fortunately, she was there for him to sort of counsel him out of those difficult situations. But one wonders, what kind of support could institutions, could schools offer to parents like Syra, who are experiencing disabling environments at the intersection of their diagnosis, but also their ethnic identity. And what can we do when communities come back to us and say that there is racism? And there's a lot to think about it in terms of, when the official narrative now, in the context of last year's report on Seoul report, denying that there is no institutional racism, what is the kind of message that institutions want to adopt? Do they want to reinforce that official narrative, or they want to challenge this and come forward and say, actually, our systems are not perfect. Our systems are, exclusive, and we need to be changing our systems. She also had a daughter at 16 years of age. This daughter has social, emotional, mental health needs. She was also very depressed, and she also was experiencing bullying experiences at her school. She was being specifically targeted because she was British Pakistani. And again, so this daughter stopped attending because she wanted to avoid those particular contexts in which she's experiencing these negative these racist incidents. And so when Syra was called into the office to discuss truancy, to discuss why her daughter is missing out on school, the interesting thing is that the schools lean to their easiest tropes of stereotypes or stereotypes. They assume that there was something going on in the house, that there was a case of domestic violence, that there was a case of forced marriages, that perhaps that explains why Farah, her daughter, was experiencing depression and not turning up to school. And she was very aware, again, this, it leans into Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, of knowing that you're being perceived as a problem, knowing how you're being positioned and how you're being read in the room. So Syra talks about, she says in her quote, teachers think they're Asians. When their daughters are grown up, she'll leave school. But I'm encouraging her to attend university, make her own identity. And again, this talks about the kind of stereotypes that institutions have, that instead of asking the mom or the family what they need to ensure that her daughter can attend school and her daughter can have a way forward with further education, colleges, what we're doing actually is handling parents forced marriages brochures and asking them if there's a case of domestic violence in their house because they're South Asians. So there is a very heavy kind of a negative stereotyping that influences bias, that influences our actions. And when we talk about racist incidents, they don't come out of nowhere. They come out of our preconceived notions of how we view the other. Here's another family I talked to. She is a first generation immigrant, and she came specifically to support her child in this country because her child had autism, and she had tried everything in Pakistan at that point in time to make sure that her child could attend an inclusive school, but it didn't happen. She was a consultant, her so and she had that kind of currency in the sense that she could immigrate to UK based on her professional qualifications. So she was not a full British citizen at that point in time, and she was again challenging this kind of assumption that just because I'm an immigrant, just because I have come to this country, doesn't mean I am a burden on the state. And there was always this quick rush to always clarify that what she's doing in terms of contributing to the welfare state. So she says in this quote, seeing an Asian family, some white people assume we just don't have manners and that kind of impression. So you say sorry, even if it's not your fault. And she was talking here about the experiences of taking her son out in public spaces, whether it's shopping malls or Tesco's or Sainsbury, and being aware that because she's South Asian, she's viewed as unruly, she's viewed as uncivilized. And when her son acts out, or when he's finding environments that are very overwhelming or very stressful, and when he's crying, or when he is getting angry at people not waiting for him to wait for him to cross the road or something, there's this perception from public that is almost judging her, that is almost saying, can't you do better at raising your kids? And this is what she said to me. She said that, I get these looks a lot because people think that, I need to parent better. And that perception of people thinking we're unruly, we're uncivilized, it's you can't every day resist that, or you can't every day challenge this because you don't have the energy sometimes to challenge this. And you just move on, you say sorry, and then you just move on, even if it's not your fault. She also talks about accessibility and this assumption that immigrants are a burden on welfare state. And one wonders where that assumption comes from. We have so much of media discourse on how certain types of refugees and immigrants need to be categorized as problematic, as non-integrationist, as separatist, as problematic, as threatening, as unruly. And she talks about that when she came to this country, and even when I was talking to her, she says, I'll start the quote, "I don't get a break. I'm getting more tired day by day. I'm just burning out. I'm on my own. I don't have my family here to help me. I hardly get any support from husband. I leave carers when I'm at work, and when I come back, they leave immediately. I pay them myself because I don't have the recourse to public funds at the moment. Maybe once when I get a UK passport, I can apply for some," end quote. And this again shows that when we talk about immigrants, there's this natural assumption that all immigrants exercise the same kind of rights or they enjoy the same kind of benefits. There's a hierarchy involved, and it's a racialized hierarchy. So she was completely self-financing her child's support. She was completely self-financing her child's ABA therapy, whatever after-school services that she could afford for her child. And again, there was this, this inherent kind of desire to clarify that, look, I'm not asking anything from the state right now, but maybe once when I get British citizenship, my child can have a better experience or better access to different provisions that other disabled children, other disabled young people have. So not all disabled people, again, when we talked about state-sanctioned narrative of disability that Sami Shock talks about, we need to understand that that narrative rewrites a history. It says that all disabled people, all disabled young people have access to the same types of schools and services, when actually, in actuality, they don't. It is deeply, intersected with their gender, ethnicity, race, immigrant status, social class. So we need to have a very intersectional analysis of these things. I want to draw towards the end of my talk, and I hope by doing so, I I push you to reflect on what it means to engage in disability justice and why everybody should be involved in disability justice. For me, we operate in an able bodied, heteronormative, middle class, cis, white supremacist structure that punishes anyone who falls short of this standard. So, when we want to think about disability justice, what do we mean by it? There's a wonderful paper by Patricia Byrne, Aurora Levins, David Langstaff, and Sins Invalid, which is an organization by disabled advocates. And it talks about what are the principles of disability justice. So firstly, they say, first and foremost, you can't talk about disability justice without intersectionality. And this is why I thought I should talk about what is intersectionality. It is about challenging patriarchy. It is about thinking about how different social inequalities affect different minorities in different ways. It involves leadership of those most impacted. So when institutions say that we are proud representatives or we are listening to our minorities, they need to understand that there's, for them to do this authentically, they need to engage with people who are most affected by it. They need to make sure that they're not just talking to gatekeepers in that situation. They need to make sure that it's not racial gesture politics or that it's tokenistic in nature. It has to have an anti-capitalist politics. What that means is that, and it's very difficult to do this in the sense that when we talk about challenging Islamophobia, how do we challenge Islamophobia in an environment where every education system has to enforce the prevent training? And we are socialized into viewing certain populations in a different way. I've been in 3 different institutions, and each time I've had to take prevent training as part of induction meetings. And I often wonder, I always find this so problematic that I'm asked to do this training where I have to reflect on certain kinds of examples, and most of these examples are always leaning somehow to very problematic tropes. And I'm always thinking, well, we have to question our complicity. We have to talk about thinking of better ways of engaging with our communities, and talk about complicity. Cross-movement solidarity. Disability justice cannot move forward without cross-movement solidarity. If you're talking about solving or improving educational experiences of your student population, you can't do that without thinking about forging or bridging with health professionals, educational professionals, care professionals, housing sector. The COVID and the pandemic over the last 2 years has given us a lesson to reflect on, because we've realized that the Black and Brown communities were disproportionately, impacted by the COVID because they were at the front line of these services, as published by the Runnymede Trust report, and for various other social aspects. So when we're talking about their student engagement, are we actually applying a tunnel vision, or are we thinking about how do we acknowledge the wider social inequalities and make sure that they're supported in their wider settings and not just within educational settings? Recognizing wholeness. What does it mean to recognize people in their entirety, to give them full citizenship, to give them full ownership of, to give them dignity, to give them their full rights? We might think that we operate in a free society, but we don't. We operate in a society, as I said, that employs several surveillance mechanisms and policies that specifically target and erase parts of our identities, especially if we're talking about minoritized communities. Sustainability. We talk about sustainability because when we come up with initiatives, when we come up with schemes and projects or programs, these are often short term. They're often 2 to 3 years, and they're often based on the idea that it's based on the notion of cultural deficit of those communities. So we want to improve those communities because they lack certain things. They don't lack certain things. They don't lack any kind of cultural capital that you're thinking. They have critical consciousness. They have agency what they require is that for you to invite them to, these solutions and make sure that they are involved in coming up with their own solutions. So it has to be sustainable, it has to be long term, and it has to be participatory. Commitment to cross disability solidarity, and we've touched on cross movement solidarity, and it links to this. Interdependence. I think one of the biggest things to convince people is why should we advocate, or why should we be concerned about disability justice? And the reason is we are all implicated in this, And I think, again, when I think about what's happening in Ukraine, when I think about the war and the conflict and the trauma that Ukrainian people are experiencing, I'm thinking that the world has always been on fire. It's always been on fire. Syria, Yemen, Palestine, all these countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, you can name so many countries that have always been, burning and always been subjected to terror, and always been, the children in these countries are always experiencing trauma. And our lives are interdependent. We have to have a holistic lens. We have to understand that we cannot liberate unless we liberate everyone. And that, again, roots back to feminist stance. So it has to be triggered with collective access, making sure that if we are providing access to one specific population, maybe it's just a South Asian community, we are not, sidelining or excluding Black community or Black students in a particular school. And again, it goes back to collective liberation. We cannot be free unless all of us are free. And that's a quote from, I think, Audre Lorde. So I want to end my talk with these principles, because I think they ask us to reflect, me, you, everyone in this space, on what we can do on our own individual role towards achieving disability justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. That was wonderful. So much food for thought, and we're really grateful that you were able to join us this afternoon. I'd just like to encourage those of you that are watching, if you have got any questions that you'd like to put forward to Sana, then do write them in the comments section. Whilst we wait for any questions to come in, I've just got a couple for you, if that's okay. Not too many. My first one's about whether you can elaborate on why disability justice is a feminist issue.
Thanks for the question, Leanne. I think this is such a interesting question, because what I don't want is protection or the brand of feminism. What I want is to emphasize the point that if feminism isn't intersectional, it isn't feminism. It is then serving a white, cis, middle-class, able-bodied discourse, if it is just serving white middle-class females. And I think one of the recent examples that pushed us to think about why disability justice is a feminist issue again, and I hope people reflect on this, is the recent Britney Spears news on conservatorship and guardianship. And people were immediately concerned about it, and they were talking about, this is so tragic, this is so unfair, we need to save Britney. There were several campaigns, and here disabled activists and advocates were saying, we've been talking about conservatorship for ages. You have not just been listening to us. You have not listened to us clearly, because it's not just able-bodied women that are punished by patriarchal procedures. It's disabled people who are being punished for such for decades, about their agency being completely wiped out of this process. So I think the reason why it is a feminist issue is because if you are not including again, in an intersectional analysis of different social inequalities, then it's just serving one particular type of population.
Thank you. I'm looking at the questions, no other, so I've got another one for you. And that is, how is challenging the patriarchy linked to disability justice?
I think when I was referring to patriarchy, I was not just referring to family patriarchal or communal patriarchal structures. They exist. They exist in every setting, in every culture, in every community. It's not just South Asians. It's within white middle class communities. They have their own patriarchal structures to deal with. But mainly, I was talking about institutional patriarchy that always adopts this condescending and almost patronizing approach to engaging with minoritized communities and continuously developing schemes or interventions that on the face of it looks like an inclusive solution or it seems to be forging a way forward. But in reality, these measures, they're just situating the blame of exclusion of exclusive experiences on disabled families. So a case in point is beyond the use of UDL. How does our curriculum, perpetuate able-bodiedness? How often have we actually, we're talking about decolonizing curriculum, we're talking about a racially just curriculum. How often how often are academics or institutions pushed or schools pushed to consider the representation or the perpetuation of able-bodiedness in the curriculum, in their teaching practices? And this is an ongoing issue because it impacts everybody. It presents a version of reality that is not authentic, that is further reinforcing these social inequalities. So we need to be thinking about these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you. I've got one final question for you, Sana, and that is, can you give us another example that would help to clarify how an intersection analysis, big word, plays into disability justice?
I think one of the most recent examples is the National Borders Act and the immigration policies becoming more and more hostile. We're talking about how immigrant communities are going to be specifically targeted by these immigration policies. And institutions need to be doing something proactive about this. They need to be thinking about providing a sense of belongingness that just does not situate itself within educational settings, but extends beyond that. How do you assure communities that we value you? We are here for you if the policies and the wider structures say you can be uprooted and flown out of the country in a day, you know? So immigrant communities are deeply right now impacted by racist immigration policies. And we will continue to face these harsh truths, whether in the light of Ukrainian war that's happening right now, or other wars like Syrian, Iraqi, Afghanistan, all these places where there are potential conflicts because of global North interventions, one could argue. And we are having students come in, and we have communities, coming into UK with substantial trauma, with substantial, mental health support needs. And we need to be thinking about: are we acknowledging that? Are we just, saying this is just a cultural issue or a linguistic issue? Or are we actually engaging and recognizing their entirety, their humanity, their histories, their positive, past, and what they can bring into schools and institutions? So I think an intersectional analysis is really important when we think about disabled communities within a minority context.
Thank you so much, Sana. That's all the questions from me. So thank you for responding to those. I can see we haven't got any in the chat. So I would just like to finish here and just say a huge thank you again for coming along and speaking to us this afternoon. This has been recorded, so it'll be available for people to watch again or share with colleagues who weren't able to join us today on YouTube, I think. With that, like I say, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you.
Sana.